And Soon the Darkness for 1970 isn't exactly a typical British horror film. I mean, I doubt if it cost that much more than the average Hammer horror movie or Amicus anthology picture, or the kind of tougher new wave films like Witchfinder General or Scream and Scream Again that were around at the time. And it's also not quite the kind of horror film that you associate with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee and monsters and vampires and Frankenstein and all that kind of stuff, which was what had been the dominant mode of British horror from the late 50s through to the early 70s. But there was this other kind of horror, which is very British, which has its roots, I think, in things like a couple of Agatha Christie stories. One of her novels, Endless Night, was filmed the same year, and she wrote a novel and then a play called Love from a Stranger, which has a similar vibe. Or even something like Gaslight. There are all these stories about fragile, vulnerable women who nobody will believe, who are somehow in the presence of either one single domineering, dangerous man, or, as in this case, a whole array of suspicious characters, any one of whom probably has evil intent. Two girls go on a cycling holiday to France. They go to a region which does not look like a fun holiday destination at all, and fall out over the fact that there's nothing much to do. And we are told that there have been a series of mysterious disappearances and murders of young girls, worse than murder, we're told, in the area. And so therefore there's obviously a threat, and then one of the girls goes missing and the other girl can't get anyone to help her.
Mademoiselle, vous voulez gendarme?
Yes. Do you know where I can find him?
Mais pourquoi? Why?
It's my friend. She's missing. Gone.
C'est son amie. Elle a disparu. C'est pourquoi elle veut parler aux gendarmes.
Je t'ai dit, débarrasse-toi d'elle.
Allez-vous-en. Go.
Why?
Trouble.
But of course, the main point of it is that there's a psycho killer around, and inevitably there's a whodunit aspect as to who is the psycho killer. And of course, the heroine is going to put her trust in the wrong people. Again, this is a slasher or a psycho movie convention, isn't it? You always rush to the one person you shouldn't, and shy away from the guilty-seeming red herring who would actually help.
Jane? Jane? I want to see you. Face to face. Then we can talk and I can explain everything. Jane? Jane? Jane!
It's set in France, which is not actually unusual for British horror. Before Psycho in 1960, the big horror film that was a kind of crossover to the mass market beyond, people who wouldn't go and see vampire movies or zombie films, was Henri-Georges Clouzot's Les Diaboliques of 1956, which is a twisty murder mystery, also with a fragile woman who's being driven mad. And that, being a French film, is set in France. Strangely, that was so influential that a whole bunch of British films which didn't need to be set in France were. Hammer made a run of films, including Taste of Fear, Maniac, and Crescendo, all set in France. There was no particular reason any of those stories couldn't have been made in Surrey, except perhaps the filmmakers, wanted a holiday. But also, somehow France had become associated with this genre. I wonder if it has anything to do with the way that French film critics loved Alfred Hitchcock so much that they just wanted to make films like him. And it's almost like, you know, that thing where the cover version becomes its own thing and creates its own mood. You could almost say it's cultural appropriation, isn't it? The French taking the sort of Britain come Hollywood Hitchcock mode and doing something else with it, and creating its own vibe, which then here we have British filmmakers coming along and imitating a French imitation of a British American filmmaker, which, yeah, gives you several layers of meaning and several sort of removes from the power of the original story. I actually think that that's quite nice. I like the circularity of influence, the way the story keeps telling itself over and over and over, and you come back to where you started. And also, it's that notion that you're vulnerable on holiday. It's a big horror theme recently, not so much then. I think of movies like Hostel, yeah, which are all about you should never go abroad, you should never trust a foreigner, you never go anywhere where you're beyond your sort of a phone call from home, or you can't speak the same language as the police, and even if you could, you probably wouldn't trust them because they don't have your best interests at heart.
Loathsome business. She was young and pretty. They always are, I suppose. Loathsome business. It was more than murder, if you know what I mean. Still, she was asking for trouble. Alone on the road.
She wasn't a local girl, then?
Tourist. Hiking her way across. Loathsome business. Sex.
And so there's this sort of underlying bubble of tourist paranoia that's very distinctive for And Soon the Darkness. There are a couple of other sort of rather sunstruck holiday trip horrors. There's a movie called Eyewitness, which has a similar vibe as well. And they all starred actresses like Pamela Franklin and Michele Dotrice and Susan George, Susan Penhaligon, Jill Howarth. These sort of ambitious starlets of the late 60s, sort of pretty girls with serious acting chops. And they built a whole run of films around them being in peril. And because Britain has such an array of great character actors, there were plenty of suspects to surround them. Plenty of great actors who could come in and be leeringly ominous. There were a lot of films about this time about schoolgirls in danger. That seemed to be a big theme. And maybe there's also the sense that foreign travel was opening up. It was becoming much, much more common for young people in particular to go abroad for their holidays rather than Brighton or Skegness. When this went out, I think it would have had a broader appeal. Obviously, being a film about girls, it's a film that would appeal to female moviegoers in the way that maybe some of the Frankenstein movie wouldn't. It's on that cusp of suspense thriller and outright horror movie. The original campaign very heavily pushed the name that this is the kind of film Hitchcock used to make. And indeed, in The Lady Vanishes is English woman goes on holiday abroad, this menaced film, and he made several other movies along those lines. I don't think this is a particularly Hitchcockian film, although at the same time he came back to Britain and made Frenzy, which taps into this sort of cycle about imperiled women and usually charming psychopaths. That's something that actually you don't get in And Soon the Darkness. The idea that the psychopath is sort of friendly and appealing and a sort of fresh-faced young man. Here, even the young man suspect is sort of Sandor Elès, who's sinister, dark, and saturnine, rather than disarmingly good-looking and seductive, but with an evil gleam in his eye, which was what most psycho thrillers did at the time. And I think that the clever thing about that is it means that you're really on edge as to whether he's the killer or not. Really, if he'd been more sympathetic, you'd have been sure he was the killer.
Why did you take that film?
I told you.
I know you told me. What do you expect to find on it?
Probably nothing.
It's Kathy's film. It belongs to her. I'll keep it for her.
Very well.
Pamela Franklin had been a child actress. She's in The Innocents. And she had gradually made sort of bigger and bigger parts during the 60s. And so I think she's Oscar nominated for the prime of Miss Jean Brodie as a supporting actress. And she's astonishing in that. It's one of those sort of star-making performances that weirdly didn't make her a huge international movie star. She made kind of a couple of fun horror films. She's in The Legend of Hell House. But she didn't then go on to actually have the sort of career Michele Dotrice had. She became a sitcom star on British television. She's from a theatrical family. And she had her moment playing, sort of pretty blonde girls in films like this. And then started to do more serious stage and television work.
Do you ever think about being married? Settling down with one man? Yeah, I suppose that's what it's all about. It's so forever. I mean, I haven't met anyone yet that I fancied. I mean, not in that way. And there's still so many things I want to do.
They're interestingly cast. One of the things that works for them is they actually seem like real people rather than models. I mean, it's interesting, they've been actresses before. Many of the stars who appeared in films around this time came out of a modeling background or even of a sort of celebrity background. But they put in their time. They'd done the bit parts in other films and slowly built up a career. In a way, it's strange looking back on this and seeing in many ways it's the highlight of their film careers. Yeah, they have enormous and varied work in other media, but this is kind of the film that shows them off to their best advantage.
Oh, I see. So that's what this is all about, is it? That man back there.
Oh.
Now who's being bloody silly?
Anyway, what's wrong with it? We came here to enjoy ourselves, have a good time. I'm not a bloody nun, you know. I like to talk to people once in a while. You're no company.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I'm no company. Maybe we shouldn't have come away together in the first place.
Maybe we shouldn't. You're no fun. You spoil everything.
Oh, you're not exactly the life and soul of the party, you know. You haven't stopped moaning since we got here. Either you're too hot or too tired or you don't like the food.
Why don't you go? Just go.
Brian Clemens was actually a big name in British television, but also film. He'd written a lot of B pictures in the late 50s, early 60s, those kind of things that were shot inside a week. But he really made his name, although he didn't create the Avengers. He wasn't the first writer on the Avengers. He sort of shaped the way that evolved from being a straight ahead film noir thriller type show into being a much more fantastical pop art zeitgeisty 1960s cool show. And when the Avengers was cancelled, came to the end of its run, he still had a team together, him and his producer, Albert Fennell, and Robert Fuest, the director, who had started out as an art director on the Avengers and had sort of graduated to being the director of many of the stranger episodes in the last couple of seasons. And they were sort of at a loose end and put together this project. At the same time, Clemens scripted another Lady in Peril movie called Blind Terror, with Mia Farrow as a blind woman being chased around an old dark house by a psychopathic killer. So obviously he had an idea of what was going to work. At that time, Brian Forbes, who was also a filmmaker, a writer and a director and an actor, became sort of briefly a studio head. It was one of those experiments that always happens during one of the British film industry's periodic collapses. It's like, just try anything, put this guy in charge, we like his films, who knows what will turn up. And Soon the Darkness was a project that slipped through on the back of that. It is, I wonder if Clemens maybe had outlined it as a smaller movie. You could see it easily as a 60-minute B picture in black and white, made 5-10 years earlier. And after this movie, Clemens created a series for ITV, which was called Thriller. It was actually called Brian Clemens Thriller, which shows you what kind of a brand name writer he was. I mean, in Britain, he was as well known as Rod Serling and The Twilight Zone in America. I remember in the 70s, it was a huge Saturday night ratings success. These actually, they stand up quite well, even though the production values are quite primitive by contemporary standards. They're all shot on video in the studio, but they have great character actors, interesting leading ladies, and these terrific premises. I think Clemens came up with more variations on woman being in a room with a plausible man who slowly reveals that he's a homicidal maniac than anyone else. I mean, this theme, he did it over and over and over. Actually, you can see it throughout his work on shows like The Avengers and later The Professionals. Many of his spy shows hinge on moles or traitors or members of the establishment who turn out to be baddies. He seemed to have had a sort of a distrust of authority that comes through here, where you the police are not the people to go to. Yeah, older people are not who you want to put your trust in. That seems it's a very sort of late 60s, 70s attitude, and you don't associate him with those kind of protest type movies, but it was obviously so ingrained in the spirit of the times that it even turns out in absolutely straightforward thrillers like And Soon the Darkness still have this sort of don't trust anyone over 30 vibe to them, which I think made them enormously appealing at the time, but it's also something that resonates now. Now perhaps we're more used to not trusting the people in charge, but then it was kind of shocking.
She's dead. Gus is dead. And he is so I killed him. He's over there.
Ah là 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 là. Tu n'as rien à craindre.
He's dead. I did it.
Tu n'as rien à craindre.
I did it. I did it.
Fuest was actually, I think, part of the package to make this film. As I say, it's the team who had made The Avengers, when they weren't making The Avengers, just moved on to make this film. This was his first feature. He pretty immediately made a clutch of other British movies. There was a period in the early 70s when it was quite hot. He made a version of Wuthering Heights, and then he made the 2 Dr. Phibes movies with Vincent Price, and then The Final Program, an adaptation of a Michael Moorcock novel. After that, he went to America and made weird things like The Devil's Reign and Revenge of the Stepford Wives, and sort of didn't really capitalize much on how successful this little clutch of films were. He didn't go on to be a mainstay of the British film industry. Some people say that it's because he was more interested in the art direction than the stories, although In this particular case, I don't think that's true, or maybe having the writer on board as a producer kept him focused on the storytelling. But I think he's a good director of actors. All his films have really interesting performances. It has been said that Brian Clemens wished he could have directed this himself. And Clemens did later go on to direct Captain Kronos' Vampire Hunter for Hammer Films, a very different kind of horror film. And he did a pretty good job of it. He probably could have made a fair fist of this. But what I think Fuest brings is that weird sense of atmosphere, of landscape, of the big empty skies. And if you've ever been on a holiday to northern France, or if you've ever been stuck there during the rain, you'll remember how empty it can seem as a country. And I think he gets that. And so it is a director's film. Suspense films on the whole are. It's a film that does all the suspense tricks. It's something that I like about these kind of movies, where it's not that thing of springing surprises on you, which is what a lot of people think thrillers are about. It's about telling you what's going to happen and then forcing you to watch it happen quite slowly, and sometimes in delaying the thing. You know from going in that this isn't going to be a happy film about two girls having a great holiday and meeting a couple of nice guys and having a sort of Cliff Richard type ending. This is obviously set up to be a creepy, scary movie. You can tell from the first moments that bad things are going to happen. Somehow wearing shorts and being on bicycles in the middle of nowhere, it seems that it literally exposes the girls to danger. And when the suspects aren't looking at them, the camera is. It's full of moments where the camera seems to be creeping up on them. All these years on, what might seem slightly tame is it doesn't have much in the way of murder. It's not a particularly gruesome horror film. And that's not to say that there weren't gruesome horror films being made at the same time. If you compare it with other British horror pictures, or even other British sort of tough thrillers, it was already an era where, you had enormous amounts of, of stabbing and bleeding and strangling and, gratuitous nudity and all the kind of exploitation elements of that era. I mean, in many ways, 1970, 71 was a high point in violence in movies. There was a sensorial backlash against it shortly after. But this isn't a film that goes down that route. Robert Fuest's Dr. Phibes films are full of the most gruesome, ghastly incidents, which are dwelled on lovingly by the camera. This isn't. This is very tactful and discreet about its horrors. But then it does spring a couple of single-shot shock moments at you. So it is a film that does deliver its scares in the end. Visually, the film is rather unfussy. Most horror movies at the time went with sort of crash zooms and shot cuts and all kinds of trickery of lighting or gothic sets. Even the fact that many British horror films had period settings was a sort of distancing effect. This is one of those movies that say it tries to convince you that this is really happening, rather than presenting a fairy tale vision of the world where you know that you don't live in that world. This is a movie that seems to exist in our universe, and the film looks much as it would if it were a straight drama about two girls on holiday.
We're not supposed to be stopping. It's not that kind of a holiday.
I don't know what kind of a holiday it's meant to be. I mean, it's just miles of road, all the same. We never see anybody, we don't meet anybody.
We've only been going a couple of days.
It's so boring. We don't do anything.
We will.
You keep saying that.
When we get to Sandor,
Well, I've got where I'm going.
It was, I think you can say, a minor hit, not a huge hit. It was well reviewed, but only in that sort of slightly grudging way British critics review thrillers or films that they don't regard as entirely seriously. They all said sort of good of its type, pat it on the head and send it round the not the multiplexes, but around the cinema circuits. It really, I think, found its audience. I first saw it on television in the 1970s, and it was maybe because it's a horror film that's not particularly gruesome. You could air it on television and not get any complaints. So it played a lot on TV. It was one of those films that was on 9:30 or 11:30 on a weeknight, almost on rotation. It may also be the growing reputation of Brian Clemens, Robert Fuest helped it. But yes, it wasn't a big breakout hit, but it was a sort of simmering, slow burning success, and it's certainly a film that people remember. I've occasionally worked for publications that do that thing where readers write in and say, what was the film where? And they always give you a hook, and usually you can either find out instantly what it is or you've no idea what it is because it's so general. But this is one of those films that comes up quite often in what is the film where? What's the film with the two girls on the cycling holiday and the murderer? That's its own bit of immortality, isn't it? It's being lodged in the popular consciousness, the collective memory like that. If not influential, it certainly has successors. It's certainly a template for the kind of unwary young people on holiday run into psychopathic violence movie that we have seen over and over again, particularly in the last 20 years. Say maybe we now tend to tell this story about Eastern Europe or South America rather than about France, but this story does get told over and over again.
Did you get your bum pinched?
No, that's Italy. They'll do anything in Italy.
Huh? What are we doing in France, then? Hey, I must say, this is the best place we've hit so far. It's not exactly swinging, but it is dangling.
One of the reasons that I think this film holds up is it's not particularly wedded to its era. It's not particularly trendy. Michele Dotrice does have an amazing 1970 wardrobe in it. Certainly that's one of the things that's sort of appealing now about it. But it's not full of dated slang. It's not full of prog rock music. It's not full of people having arguments about the big issues of the era. It is a classical type story. It's a story that could happen at any time in history. It makes sense at any time. In fact, one of the earliest version of this story, the urban legend of the Disappearing Holidaymaker, is a story about the Paris exposition of the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th century, which was made into a film called So Long at the Fair. So it's like that, and that's a very Victorian version of this plot. And it has been remade. They made a version set in South America in 2010. So this story can be recycled and told over and over, and it will almost always work. It always connects with kind of underlying anxieties we all have about going away.